So I was recently on the Sunshine Coast with my family for Canada Day, and I had that experience. If you've ever been to the Sunshine Coast, Seychelles is more or less a small town, and they throw a lot of community events, and they're not particularly polished or dramatic or exciting, but for my 4-year-old and my 7-year-old, they're plenty of fun. So amidst the sort of hula hooping and face painting and the ice cream truck, there was a magician there who was performing. He's lived on the coast for a while now, and he's in his 7th decade, and I've never asked him when he started doing magic, but I feel like it might have been when he was a child, and that this is a long-time love for him. So my children were watching the magician, and we were loving his tricks. My kids don't understand his banter at all, but it was still that sense of wonder when they were watching him. They get quite solemn when they're watching a magician. They're very serious watching it, but you can see that they're learning something about the world when he does his tricks. They're learning that somehow the world might be slightly different than they imagine. But while this was happening, I couldn't help notice and hear the reaction of some other children that were there. And what they were doing was calling out during the performance. So they were saying things like, "You're flicking the bag. You must have put the card in your pocket." All through his performance, they couldn't suspend into a state of wonder. They could only see with eyes that were going to find the literal truth of that moment. So other than the rudeness, which did actually break my heart a little bit, I was really struck by the lack of wonder in some of those children there. The lack of willingness to suspend their judgment just a little bit to see if the world revealed itself to be different than what they thought it was. So there was no capacity in that moment to be amazed or changed or transformed by the world. Okay, that might be a bit harsh, I admit it. And obviously, I'm not saying that we should return to magical thinking. I've had enough of listening to Donald Trump to not be really clear that magical thinking is quite dangerous, right? I mean, it's been very harmful to our society, so I'm not trying to send us back to a time where we're divorced from reason or anything like that. But what the question I was left with was, how often does our way of thinking prevent us from dealing with issues that arise in the world a little bit differently? Or rather, when is our way of seeing causing some problems? Because I don't know about you, but I'm very weary of the world at the moment. I know it's summer and there is enough color and heat and light that maybe when you're outside in nature, you can feel the beauty of creation. You can feel the holiness or the sacredness of life, of the planet, maybe even of each other. And that's wonderful, that state of awe that you can be in, and recognizing that your small life is part of that creation, part of that awe. But on the other hand, whenever I turn on the news or check my news feeds, what I keep feeling bombarded with this summer is fighting and anger and violence and bigotry and hatred, and it seems to not be ceasing at all. In some ways, we live here and we live in the best of times with the latest in healthcare, with solid education, with access to food and water and employment and many, many other gifts that we have earned simply by being born here. And yet, despite this, even here, we remain haunted by the same sets of issues that are around the globe. We are haunted by racism, by poverty, by inequality, by hatred, and we can add more to that list, can't we? I'm sure there are things in your heart that you've been holding this summer that you could add to that. And I think the interesting thing is that the problems that we have appeared to have gotten more complex Gone are the days that we could say something about war and drill it down to a single cause. Now we live in a time where we are starting to recognize the deep interconnections of everything. We're a bit like a fly in the web at the moment, realizing that all the threads, when we move, are being pulled. So, for example, you can't talk about the rate of incarceration of First Nations men in Canada without talking about many other causes. And this is both confusing and exciting, because maybe our problems, though complex, are not complicated. Maybe it's time to stop using our old ways of seeing, and to paraphrase Paul, who we heard in the passage that Brandon read today, to start using spiritual ways to solve what are deeply spiritual problems. So to see things with new eyes. So much like the children who were engaging with the magician, perhaps our very way of thinking is preventing us from seeing a holy way forward. In the passage from 1 Corinthians that we read today, we learn that we might need to address the reality of the world, not with our usual ways of thinking and understanding, but with what Paul is talking about, with spiritual eyes. And Paul actually knows what he's talking about, because prior to this, he had a very fixed way of thinking. And his purpose was to hold the world in a particular frame and then to eradicate everything that didn't conform to it. So one of the things that he's doing prior to these letters is he's persecuting people who follow Christ, the Christ followers. These new groups of people that are working with what was the Jewish faith at the time and now are transformed through their understanding of Christ. And so Paul is sort of a prime detective or prime police chief for hunting those folks out and having them arrested and persecuted and even killed, right? And so as he is doing this, he has this unusual moment where all of a sudden, in pursuit of his chase, he is struck by God, who speaks to him and strikes him blind. And like a diver who is dropped into a pool of water, for 3 days he is immersed in the Spirit. He can't see, he can't walk, he can't apply his frameworks because they're gone. All he can do is rest in God for 3 days. And when he does get his sight back, what he notices is that he is seeing as if with new eyes. He is seeing in a spiritual way. And after that, his whole life changes and gets way more complicated, actually. And I think there's a very interesting lesson in that for our own selves. Because I don't judge Paul too harshly here. When I get trapped in looking at the world in a certain way, I just keep repeating the same steps over and over again. I don't learn. And when I use that framework, I can't fathom what else to do. So as Paul moves through the world with new eyes, he tries to communicate that. And I think we all know how difficult that is, to try and talk about spiritual things with language. But he gives it a try. He tries to explain how all of his relationships are transformed by seeing through this new lens. He tries to explain how language and the old ways of being are going to fail you as you try to approach the world. He tries to also say that what's happening to him is open to everybody. There's no special people anymore. No people who get to be more spiritual or more elite or more powerful. It's open to everybody. And what he asks them to do is to try to open to spirit and allow themselves to be changed. So we're probably not going to get the experience that Paul gets. I'm assuming we're probably not going to be walking around in our lives and one day get struck by spirit. But there may be some of you here who have had that experience, and you're holding that secret truth in your heart. And sometimes it looks a little different. Sometimes it can be a heart attack, for example, And when we awaken, we find our understanding of ourselves and the world transformed. Or sometimes it can be through falling in love or a hike in the woods. So you may get that experience. But for the rest of us, we might have to find another way to open to Spirit. And fortunately, we do have a practice that can help us that way. And that practice is prayer. I think it's fair to ask, what the heck is prayer anyways? I can't say that, Christianity has done a particularly great job of communicating what prayer is. I think most people's understanding of prayer is a little bit light. Mine certainly is. And most of the time, I think how prayer gets explained to us is a kind of asking to God to intervene or to ask God for help. And that's not quite what Paul is meaning by prayer, and that's not quite what the Christian mystics mean by prayer. There is actually an ancient Christian tradition of something called contemplative prayer, which is less about us directing something to God and asking for something specific, but rather a way of opening our bodies and our minds to letting God unfold through us. And I think that's what Paul is trying to talk about. A way of opening ourselves to God and letting it flow through us. And then letting God be the eyes from which we see the world. Paul calls that having the mind of Christ. And so his idea very much is that can descend into our own bodies. So let's just sit with that idea, the mind of Christ. The idea that we can all have that. So what would a mind of Christ do to addressing suffering in the world? Would a Christ mind based on unlimited love have any issues at all with the LGBTQ identity or gender identity? No, it wouldn't. Would a Christ mind look at systematic racism and the kind of blindness we can have to the advantages we have and then blame others for that problem? It wouldn't. So what kinds of healing, what kinds of action might come from all of us and from me if we opened ourselves to a Christ mind and let us be led by that? What if we were humble enough and trusting enough to let that lead us? But to do that, we're going to have to learn or relearn how to pray. So some of you might know local teacher Cynthia Bourgeot, and I don't know if I'm saying her name right. She is a Christian mystic, and she lives on Vancouver Island and runs a center for contemplative prayer and practice. And she gives some very good basic ways to try and find a new yet ancient way of praying. So we're going to try it out today. So luckily, there's only a few steps to it. And so what she is trying to do is to get us to self-empty, which is at the heart of prayer, and it's one of the central teachings of Jesus, and to open to God so that we can find a way of being transformed. And so there's only 3 steps, and the first step is the easiest one. So like any form of meditation, if you've done meditations, it's very similar. It's very much rooted in similar practices. You find a body posture that you can hold for a while. So since we're in pews, our options are a little more limited, but a simple one is just feet on the ground, palms up on your lap, right? Some of us might want to sit on the floor or in the aisle. You're welcome to do that, to sit cross-legged. And then one of them is obviously kneeling. So find something that's comfortable. That's the first thing we do, to still our bodies. The next one is simply to shut our eyes and to roll our gaze skyward. And so that is in literally every meditation and prayer practice that you can research. There is something about the very action of rolling your eyes skyward that stimulates actually a part of the brain that is central for relaxation and for imagination. And so from the contemplative practice, we're directing our mind towards God. And now the third step, which of course is the hardest, which is why we save it for last. What we want to try to do is open ourselves to whatever we understand to be God or the holy. And we want to open our attention to that. And if you have a mind like mine that moves around too much, then what Cynthia asks you to do is to find one word that will bring your attention back to this practice. And it doesn't matter what the word is, but when you find your thoughts drifting, you say the word in your mind and bring your attention back. So let's just sit in that space. And I'll get us to bring our attention back to the room and to open our eyes. As always, it gives me great delight to be at Canadian Memorial because you're always so willing to take the risk and try it. So thank you. So I'll be curious later to see what that felt like. And I'm also inviting anyone who's interested to engage with me this week on a daily prayer practice. And at the end of the service, I'll be at the back, and if you want to give me your email, and I'll send a few things over the week. But initially, this might be hard, engaging in this kind of prayer practice. It might even, dare I say it might even be boring initially. But if we are truly brokenhearted about the violence and the suffering that we see in the world, if we truly want to move towards changing it or ending it, if we truly no longer want to be a part of creating it, then we have to try. We have to try to find a way to transform ourselves. We have to try and find a way to open to something larger, something that will teach us how to love unconditionally. And we might find through this type of practice that, like Paul, we'll be able to see with spiritual eyes. And maybe, just maybe, the healing of our world will be possible. May it be so. Amen.